It was a Wednesday night in early March when Ava first sensed something wasn't right. She had just finished a late cram session for her upcoming calculus exam and headed downstairs quietly to get a glass of water. Her house was usually quiet after 10 p.m., especially since her stepfather insisted on strict sleep schedules and no wandering after hours. But that night, she heard voices coming from the kitchen. At first, she thought it was the television left on low. But as she approached the hallway, she realized it was her mother and stepfather talking. Ava paused just behind the corner, not out of intention to eavesdrop, but because she recognized her name. Her mother's voice, weary and tight, floated through the half-open door. "She's almost 18, Mark. We've done enough. I can't keep doing this. She needs to learn to manage on her own." Ava stood frozen. Her first instinct was that maybe they were talking about responsibility, about encouraging her to take on more chores or pay for her phone. But the next words turned her blood cold. The way they'd stopped including her in any family decisions, even discussions about dinner or weekend plans. It all lined up. This had been coming. She just hadn't seen it. Ava wasn't the kind of girl who went to parties or had a crowd of friends to crash with. She had spent most of high school either tutoring other students to make extra cash or working in the library. She didn't have an emergency plan for being thrown out. She turns 18 on Sunday. That's it. She's legally an adult. "I want her out of this house by Monday," Mark said flatly, in a tone that carried no emotion, just cold, hard resolve. Her mother didn't argue. She didn't gasp or protest. Instead, she nodded and said, "We'll tell her after the cake, maybe on Sunday night. It'll give her a day to figure things out." Ava couldn't breathe. She felt her heart pounding in her ears, a slow pressure building in her chest as though the air had turned to cement. Her grip tightened around the cold glass in her hand, and for a second she feared she might drop it and alert them to her presence. She took a step back slowly, barely breathing, and crept up the stairs one careful foot at a time, her mind racing faster than her legs could carry her. Once she was in her room, she shut the door as gently as she could, then locked it. She sank on her bed, her limbs heavy and trembling. A rush of disbelief washed over her. She thought it had to be a misunderstanding. Her mother had always been distant, but not cruel. Her stepfather had never liked her much, but she assumed that was just the usual tension between a man and his stepchild. But this was planned. It wasn't heat of the moment. It was organized. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Her instinct wasn't to cry. It was to think, to plan, to act. She stared at the chipped edge of her desk and began to replay every conversation from the last few months. The small, offhand comments her stepfather made. The growing silence from her mother. But now, she knew she needed one fast. She stayed up the rest of the night, staring at her ceiling in the dark, ideas rolling through her mind like frantic tumbleweeds. By morning, she had made a silent decision. She wouldn't wait to be kicked out. She wouldn't sit through some fake celebration and pretend she didn't know what was coming. If they wanted her gone the day she turned 18, she'd be gone before that. The rest of the week passed in a blur. Ava played her role perfectly. At school, she answered questions in class, smiled at her teachers, and acted like everything was fine. At home, she nodded quietly during dinner, did the dishes, and made no indication that she had overheard anything. But every night, after her door was locked, she worked. She gathered all her cash, about $580 she had saved from tutoring and the occasional babysitting job. She didn't have a bank account her parents didn't know about, so she kept the cash hidden in the lining of her backpack. She began packing her essentials little by little. A few clothes, her documents, the small laptop she used for school, and her old phone. She deleted every trace of herself from the family computer and logged out of every device she didn't own. She searched online for shelters, hostels, and any temporary housing that would take someone her age. Then she remembered something. A girl she'd met through a scholarship forum online, Mia, who volunteered at a youth hostel in Portland. They had messaged a few times about college prep. Ava hadn't thought about her in months, but she reached out, explaining vaguely that she needed a place to stay for a while, and asked if there were any openings or programs available for someone in her situation. Mia responded within hours. "Yes. If you can get here, we'll figure something out." It's not fancy, but it's safe. We help people like you all the time. You don't have to explain everything. The message nearly made Ava cry, but she didn't. Not yet. She couldn't afford to fall apart until she was gone. The night before her birthday, Ava stayed up late, pretending to write an essay. At midnight, while the rest of the house was asleep, she quietly pulled on her backpack, grabbed her coat, and slipped a folded note onto the kitchen table. It read, "Don't worry about me. You don't have to kick me out. I'm already gone. I wish things had been different." She took one last look around the darkened hallway. There were no family photos of her on the wall. No trace of her in the living room, except for a jacket draped over a chair. She left the house without a sound, walking the 2 miles to the Greyhound station under the orange glow of streetlights. Her bus departed at 1:45 a.m. As it pulled out of the station and the lights of her neighborhood vanished in the rearview mirror, Ava didn't cry. She stared straight ahead, her fingers gripping her backpack straps, her mind already focused on what she had to do next. She was no longer just a high school girl waiting for adulthood to be handed to her. She was now entirely on her own. And somehow, even though she was scared, a strange sense of relief washed over her. Because for the first time, her future was hers alone to shape, not theirs. The bus hummed steadily beneath Ava's seat as it sped down the highway, every bump in the road a reminder that she was moving farther and farther away from everything she'd known. She didn't sleep. She watched the dark outline of trees blur past the window and clutched her backpack close, her ID and bus ticket tucked safely inside. With every mile, her fear of the unknown battled with a growing sense of liberation. The pain of being unwanted by her own family still sat in her chest like a stone, but at least now she was choosing what came next. It took 12 hours to reach Portland. When the bus finally rolled into the terminal just past lunchtime, Ava felt numb. The terminal was loud and chaotic, filled with tired travelers, crying children, and garbled announcements over the intercom. She stepped off into the swirl of movement, uncertain where to go or who to trust. But she had a name, Mia, and an address saved in a hidden note on her phone. The youth hostel was on the east side of the city, a few blocks from Tram Stop. She asked an older woman how to get there, and after confirming it wasn't too far, decided to walk. The streets buzzed with life, vendors, musicians, cars honking, people shouting into phones. But she felt invisible in the crowd, and for once, that was a comfort. No one knew who she was. No one was waiting to throw her out. Here, she was just another face passing by. The building looked nothing like she had imagined. She expected something like a shelter, maybe a rundown brick structure or a converted warehouse. But the youth hostel was a modest 2-story house with pale green siding and a small garden out front, where lavender and daffodils pushed through the early spring soil. A wooden sign near the door read Harmony House, Youth Resource Center. It didn't scream shelter. It looked like a place someone could live. Ava hesitated before knocking. Her hand hovered just inches from the door. This was real now. She was about to walk into a life she hadn't planned for. No turning back. With a breath, she knocked twice. A girl with short curly hair and a red hoodie opened the door. She looked surprised for a second, then smiled. Ava? Ava nodded. Oh, Mia. Come in. You must be exhausted. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and old wood. The living room was cozy. Faded but clean furniture, a corkboard of announcements, and a few kids scattered on couches watching a muted TV. Ava felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe. Mia led her to the office to fill out a few forms and explain how the place worked. Harmony House was more than just a roof. It offered temporary housing for teens in transition. Those who had aged out of foster care, fled unsafe homes, or, like Ava, had no one else to turn to. There were 8 beds upstairs, a communal kitchen, and a rotating staff of volunteers and counselors who provided everything from job help to emotional support. You can stay for up to 6 weeks, Mia said, handing her a room key. After that, we'll help you transition into the next step: shared housing, subsidized rooms, college dorms. Whatever makes sense for you. You're not alone here. Ava tried to say thank you, but the words caught in her throat. She just nodded, her eyes burning. It wasn't just the relief of having a place to stay. It was hearing someone say she wasn't alone. Her room was small but clean, with a bunk bed, a dresser, and a narrow window that looked out over the back alley. She had a roommate, a girl named Kayla who was 19 and worked the overnight shift at a gas station. They didn't talk much at first. Kayla barely looked up from her earbuds when Ava came in. That was fine. Ava needed time to adjust. The first few nights, Ava didn't sleep well. She kept one foot on the floor and her backpack clutched close, half expecting to be woken up and told to leave. But no one did. Slowly, she began to let her guard down. The days at Harmony House followed a rhythm. Breakfast was served at 8 a.m. sharp, followed by optional workshops, life skills, resume writing, even college prep. Ava attended every one. She wanted to prove to herself that she could make something out of this, that her parents were wrong to think she'd fall apart without them. One afternoon, she sat in on a scholarship prep session led by a volunteer named Janet, a retired English teacher who had helped dozens of kids apply for college. Janet had a stern but warm presence, and when Ava answered a question about essay prompts with clarity and poise, Janet pulled her aside afterward. "You got a sharp mind," she said. "What's your plan?" Ava hesitated, then admitted she didn't really have one. She had been so focused on surviving the last few weeks that thinking beyond the next day felt dangerous. "Well," Janet said, "you don't have to map out your whole life today, but you should at least apply. There are community colleges here with great programs, and we've got funds to help with books and supplies." Something clicked. For the first time in weeks, Ava allowed herself to imagine a future again. She found a corner in the dining room with decent Wi-Fi and spent every evening working on applications. She wrote essays about overcoming hardship, about resilience, about the strength it took to leave instead of being discarded. It wasn't easy to revisit the pain, but it made her writing honest. Meanwhile, she began doing odd jobs around the hostel, helping in the kitchen, tutoring other residents with their GED prep, organizing donation drives. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because helping others gave her purpose. It made her feel useful again. Her parents never tried to call. Not once. She sometimes wondered if they'd reported her missing or if they'd just found the note, shrugged, and gone on with their lives. The lack of response hurt more than she expected. A part of her had hoped they'd feel guilty. Miss her. Try to reach out. But the silence was complete. 3 weeks after she arrived at Harmony House, Ava received an email from Portland Community College offering her a place in their fall program for social sciences, along with a partial scholarship. She stared at the screen for a long time before showing Mia, who hugged her tightly. "I told you," Mia said, beaming. "You're going to make it." But Ava didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. The scars of abandonment still ran deep, and every step forward felt like walking through a storm with no umbrella. Yet, she kept moving. One night, as she sat alone on the back steps behind the hostel, watching the moon hang low over the alley, Kayla came out and sat next to her. She lit a cigarette, then offered Ava one, who shook her head. "You're different than the others," Kayla said, not unkindly. "Most of us come here broken. But you left before they could break you." Ava didn't know what to say. She hadn't thought of it that way before. But maybe Kayla was right. Maybe disappearing had been her first real act of strength. The next morning, she got up early, made coffee for the house, and sat with Janet to review her financial aid forms. She was still afraid, still unsure of what came next. But she was no longer a girl waiting for her fate to be handed to her. She was building it, brick by brick, on her own terms. Ava's days began to follow a rhythm so steady it almost felt foreign, like a stranger's life she'd stepped into and started inhabiting. Morning coffee, check-in meetings with Mia or one of the volunteers, scholarship paperwork, and her part-time shifts at a used bookstore downtown. The building was dimly lit and smelled like old paper and rain. It was the kind of place where quiet people came to be invisible, and that suited Ava just fine. She'd never worked retail before, but the owner, a man named Henry in his 60s with crooked glasses and a soft spot for oddballs, gave her the job after just one conversation. He liked that she was well-read and didn't talk too much. The first few weeks, she mostly sorted boxes, shelved paperbacks, and organized author sections alphabetically. It wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent. And after months of uncertainty, consistency felt like luxury. Each paycheck, though small, gave her more than just money. It gave her control. She opened her own bank account, her own email address, her own name on a P.O. box. They were little things, but to Ava, they were symbols of independence, of dignity she'd never felt under her parents' roof. She shared a small room now with just one other girl, May, who had aged out of foster care and was trying to save enough to rent her own place. They respected each other's space, traded instant noodle flavors, and occasionally fell asleep talking about the things they missed most. For Ava, it wasn't material comfort she longed for. It was the feeling of being safe while resting. Sleeping in her childhood bed had never felt restful, not with tension humming through the walls. But here, even with cracked paint and mismatched bed sheets, she felt still. One afternoon, while helping a kid at Harmony House study for his high school equivalency exam, Ava noticed a pamphlet on the desk, Legal Aid for Youth in Crisis. It caught her eye not because she needed it, but because she knew how many others did. Kids came through Harmony House with stories that mirrored hers and others that were far worse. Evictions, abuse, trafficking, neglect. She remembered how helpless she had felt that night in her room after overhearing her parents. If she hadn't been lucky enough to find Mia or Harmony House, she didn't know where she would have ended up. That night, she asked Janet about the pamphlet. "Oh, that's from the outreach program," Janet explained. "They do legal advocacy for minors and young adults. Sometimes they take interns in the summer. It's not paid, but if you're interested," Ava was. She sent an email, wrote a cover letter that poured out of her in one sitting, and 2 weeks later, she had her first interview. The office was a cramped space above a Vietnamese bakery, with squeaky floors and walls plastered in posters about housing rights and youth justice. Her interviewer, a woman named Nia with short locks and sharp eyes, asked her tough questions. "Why do you want to work here? What makes you think you can handle the emotional toll?" Ava answered with honesty, not polish. She told Nia she'd lived through it, that she'd been on the edge and had found her way back, that she didn't want others to have to figure it out alone. Nia nodded. "You're raw, but you've got the kind of clarity we need. You start next week." The internship became a turning point. Ava spent afternoons compiling case notes, attending workshops on legal procedures, and sitting in on meetings where teenagers try to get restraining orders against parents, landlords, or traffickers. It was heavy work. It drained her some days, but it also lit something inside her, a fire that burned every time she looked into the frightened eyes of a girl no older than she was and said, "You have rights." Her academic life didn't fall by the wayside either. With Janet's help, she secured her financial aid package, enrolled in 3 classes for the fall, and started attending prep sessions to get ready for college-level writing. Some nights, she stayed up past midnight, reading textbooks and highlighting passages even though no one asked her to. It wasn't just about proving something to the world. It was about proving something to herself, that she belonged, that she deserved to be in the room. By midsummer, Ava had begun to find her voice. She started speaking in the weekly house meetings, suggesting ideas like a job board for teens or a resource swap wall. She helped redesign the communal kitchen chart and organized a used book drive so that every resident could have something of their own to read. People started coming to her with questions: how to write a cover letter, how to navigate a difficult roommate, how to apply for food assistance. And then came the day she didn't expect. Ava was on her lunch break, sitting outside the legal aid office with a sandwich in one hand and a folder in the other, when her phone buzzed. A message from a number she didn't recognize. "Ava, it's Nathan. Please call me. It's about Mom." Nathan, her younger half-brother. She hadn't heard from him since the night she disappeared. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the screen, hands trembling, unsure whether to respond. She told herself she owed them nothing. But this wasn't about them. It was about Nathan. She called. He answered on the first ring. "Ava?" His voice was hoarse. "Yes. What's going on?" There was a pause. "Mom's not doing great. She drinks a lot now. She's angry all the time. She cries about you. A lot. I think she regrets everything. She won't say it. But I know. She doesn't sleep much. She keeps rereading that note you left. Ava didn't know how to respond. Her stomach twisted. I'm not saying come back, he added quickly. I just thought, maybe you should know. It wasn't what she wanted. It was Mark. He pushed for it. Mom went along with it because she thought you hated her already. I think she thought you'd fight back, not vanish. Ava closed her eyes, pain rippling through her chest. Thanks for telling me, she said quietly. They spoke for a few more minutes, awkwardly but sincerely. Nathan was 16 now, starting to see the cracks in their family from his own vantage point. He told her he wanted to be better, that he missed her, that maybe one day they could talk again in person. When she hung up, Ava sat still for a long time, the folders slipping from her lap, pages fluttering against her shoes. She thought she had closed the chapter on her family. She had imagined them as cold, unfeeling, and done with her. But this new knowledge complicated everything. Maybe her mother hadn't wanted to throw her out. Maybe she was just too weak to say no. Maybe the silence wasn't indifference, it was guilt. But Ava didn't feel ready to reach out. Not yet. That night, she wrote a letter to her mother. Not to send, just to write. She poured out everything. The pain, the betrayal, the strength it took to leave, the strength it took to survive. And then she tucked the letter away in her drawer, unopened, unfinished. She'd decide later what to do with it. For now, she had work to do, people to help, a future to build. And for the first time, she was building it on solid ground. The letter sat in Ava's drawer for weeks, folded neatly, never sealed, never sent. Some nights, she reread it, rewriting lines in her head as if clarity would come through repetition. But each time she closed the drawer again, something held her back, a quiet resistance, or maybe just fear that reopening that door meant losing everything she had built without them. The fall semester crept closer. Ava picked up a second shift at the bookstore to afford school supplies and a monthly bus pass. The legal aid internship had ended officially, but Nia kept inviting her to community meetings and trainings. Ava began to feel more like a peer than a lost kid someone was mentoring. It was a strange, quiet pride, watching people turn to her for advice, trusting her voice, asking for her opinion. Yet the call from Nathan had planted something in her, a small, unshakable echo. She couldn't ignore it anymore. It was a Tuesday afternoon in mid-August when she finally asked for a day off. The idea of going back felt like a bad dream, but Ava knew she wouldn't be free until she saw her old life through new eyes. She packed a small tote bag, slipped the letter inside, and boarded the early bus that would take her back to the suburb she had left 5 months ago under cover of darkness. The houses looked smaller than she remembered. The manicured hedges and perfectly paved sidewalks no longer felt like safety. They felt like confinement. As she walked up the familiar block, her pulse quickened. Her old street was quiet, still framed by sycamore trees and identical fences. Her feet slowed when she reached the front gate. The house hadn't changed much. The same white paint, the same porch light with a cracked bulb. But the garden was overgrown now, weeds curling up between the concrete slabs, the flower bed untended. Something about that struck her more than it should have. Her mother had always been fastidious about the yard. She stood for a minute, unsure whether to knock or turn back. But before she could decide, the door opened. It was her mother. They stared at each other in silence. Ava expected anger, demands, accusations. But instead, her mother's face softened, crumpled, really like something inside her gave way all at once. She looked smaller than Ava remembered, more tired. Her hair had grown out in patches of gray, and her eyes were swollen, as if crying had become a habit. Ava, her voice was barely audible. Ava stepped forward slowly. I'm not here to stay. I just need to talk. Her mother moved aside without a word, and Ava entered her childhood home for the first time since she left. The air inside was stale. Dust hung on the furniture. Dishes were stacked in the sink. The old photographs were still on the hallway wall, but none featured Ava past the age of 15. That didn't surprise her. What did surprise her was the unopened envelope on the coffee table, a bank statement addressed to her. Apparently, her mail was still coming here. She sat on the edge of the couch, her mother in the armchair across. Neither knew where to begin. Finally, Ava pulled the letter from her bag and placed it on the coffee table. I wrote this after Nathan called me. I never mailed it, but I think you should hear what's in it. Her mother reached for the letter, but Ava shook her head. No, I'll read it. And she did. She read about the night. She overheard the plan to kick her out. About the silence that followed. About how deeply it cut her to realize she was so easily discarded. She read about the bus ride, the hostel, the fear, the exhaustion. About the way strangers offered her more dignity than her own parents had. About how, despite everything, she made it through and thrived. When she finished, the room was so quiet Ava could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock. Her mother's hands trembled in her lap. I didn't want it to happen that way. She whispered, I swear to you, Ava, I didn't know what I was doing. Mark, he said it was the best way, that you needed a push, that you were too dependent. I went along with it because I was tired and scared. Ava kept her voice steady. Scared of what? Of losing control, of being a bad mother, of doing everything wrong. I thought if I forced you out, maybe you'd become strong, like some tough love fantasy. But the moment you left, I realized I'd already failed. Ava looked around the room, at the life she used to know. It was all still here, but it wasn't hers anymore. She'd outgrown it. She didn't need it. She wasn't here to reclaim anything. She was here to close it. I don't want an apology you don't mean, Ava said softly. And I don't need a relationship that only exists out of guilt. But I didn't need to say this to your face. What you did broke something in me, and I rebuilt it, without you. Her mother nodded, tears running silently down her cheeks. Nathan entered the room a few minutes later. He looked older, too, more cautious. He hugged Ava without asking, tight and lingering. You look different, he said quietly. I am. They talked for a while, mostly surface level. School, work, weather. Then Ava stood. I have to go. Her mother rose, too, hesitating. Will I ever see you again? Ava thought about it. I don't know, she answered honestly. That depends on what you do next. She didn't mean it as a threat. She meant it as a truth. Outside, the air felt lighter. The sky was clear and blue in a way it hadn't been that morning. Ava walked to the station with unhurried steps, the tote bag lighter than it had felt on the way in. She had carried that chapter for so long that she hadn't realized how heavy it had become. Back in Portland, Ava returned to Harmony House one last time. Not to live, but to volunteer. She had signed a lease on a student housing unit not far from campus, a tiny one-room flat with a slanted ceiling and a bathroom the size of a closet. But it was hers. When she unlocked the door for the first time, she stood in the middle of the room for a long time, just breathing. There were no trophies, no photos, no memories from her past. But the future was wide open. She pulled out her laptop, sat cross-legged on the floor, and opened a blank document. At the top, she typed, personal statement, why I want to become a social worker. And then she began to write. She didn't write about trauma. She wrote about agency, about what it means to find your voice when others try to silence it, about survival and then growth, about not waiting to be saved, but becoming the one who saves. The story of her life hadn't begun in that house, and it didn't end with her leaving it. It began the moment she decided she was worth more than abandonment, and that she would never let anyone else feel the way she had.